Life can change in the blink of an eye, and sometimes the most unexpected encounters have the power to transform us forever. This is the story of Richard Blackwell, a self-made millionaire who believed that success was solely the result of hard work and determination. He had no patience for those who in his eyes weren't willing to put in the effort. But one fateful day, Richard's perfectly constructed worldview would come crashing down when he encountered a young boy named Jamie begging outside an upscale restaurant. Little did he know this chance meeting would lead him to question everything he thought he knew about privilege, compassion, and what truly matters in life. Richard had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal and was feeling particularly pleased with himself as he strolled through the city streets. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of success, and nothing could dampen his spirits, that is, until he spotted a thin boy with tattered clothes approaching wealthy patrons outside his favorite restaurant. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said timidly, his voice barely audible above the bustling street noise. "Could you spare some change? I haven't eaten since yesterday." Richard's expression hardened instantly. He'd heard this story 1,000 times before, and firmly believed that handouts only encouraged laziness. "Get a job," he sneered, not bothering to hide his contempt. "I was working when I was half your age." The boy's eyes widened with hurt, but instead of anger, there was something else there, a quiet dignity that momentarily caught Richard off guard. Before he could dwell on it, he brushed past the child and entered the restaurant, pushing the encounter from his mind as he prepared to celebrate his latest business triumph. The evening progressed with flowing champagne and excessive laughter. Yet something about the boy's eyes haunted Richard throughout dinner. There was a depth to them, a story untold, that nudged at his conscience despite his best efforts to ignore it. As he left the restaurant hours later, he was surprised to see the same boy still there, now huddled against the building for warmth in the increasingly cold night. Rather than approaching people, he was counting a pitiful amount of coins with trembling fingers. Curiosity got the better of Richard. "Shouldn't you be home by now?" he asked, his tone slightly less harsh than before. The boy jumped, clearly startled by the sudden attention from the man who had dismissed him earlier. "I can't go home yet, sir," he replied softly. "I don't have enough." Something in the boy's determined expression made Richard pause. Enough for what? He found himself asking, though he couldn't understand why he suddenly cared. The boy hesitated before answering. "For my mom's medicine. She needs it tonight, and I'm still $3 short." There was no self-pity in his voice, just a matter-of-fact explanation that hit Richard with unexpected force. Against his better judgment, Richard found himself reaching for his wallet. "What's your name, kid?" he asked, trying to maintain his gruff exterior. "Jamie, sir." "Jamie Foster," the boy replied, a flicker of hope crossing his face. Richard pulled out a $20 bill and handed it over, telling himself this was just to ease his conscience so he could enjoy the rest of his evening. "Get your mom what she needs," he said curtly. The gratitude that flooded the boy's face was almost painful to witness. "Thank you, sir. This will help so much. Maybe now she can eat something too." The casual mention of his mother's hunger struck Richard like a physical blow. Before he could respond, Jamie had already darted away, clutching the money as if it were a lifeline. Richard stood frozen on the sidewalk, an unsettling feeling washing over him. Something about this interaction felt different from his usual charitable donations. Those tax-deductible gestures that never required him to look into the eyes of those receiving his money. There was a story here, and despite his reluctance, Richard felt compelled to know more. The next morning, Richard couldn't shake Jamie from his thoughts. What had started as a momentary disruption to his perfect evening had somehow morphed into a persistent voice in his head. Against all rational judgment, he found himself driving back to the same neighborhood, scanning the streets for the boy with the haunting eyes. It took nearly 2 hours before he spotted Jamie emerging from a small pharmacy, a paper bag clutched tightly to his chest. Richard watched from his luxury car as the boy hurried down the street, his thin frame moving with surprising purpose and speed. Something compelled Richard to follow, though he kept a discreet distance, feeling both ridiculous and intrigued. What was he doing stalking a child through the city? Yet he couldn't turn back now. Jamie led him through progressively deteriorating neighborhoods, until finally turning into an alleyway beside a dilapidated apartment building with boarded windows and graffiti-covered walls. Richard parked his car and hesitated, the gleaming vehicle looking absurdly out of place in these surroundings. Every instinct told him to drive away. He'd done his good deed already, hadn't he? But the memory of Jamie counting those few coins with such concentration pulled him forward. He followed the path Jamie had taken, finding himself at the back entrance of the building, where a makeshift ramp constructed from plywood and scrap materials led to a basement door. The contrast between this crude access point and the marble steps of his own home was jarring. Richard approached cautiously, noticing how the ramp had been carefully reinforced despite the poor materials. Someone had put considerable thought into its construction. As he neared the door, he could hear Jamie's voice drifting out from inside. "I got it, Mom. The pharmacist gave me the generic one like you said, and it was cheaper, so I even got some soup and bread too." The woman's response was too weak for Richard to make out clearly, but the tenderness in her tone was unmistakable. Feeling suddenly like an intruder, Richard almost turned to leave when a fit of violent coughing erupted from inside, followed by Jamie's panicked voice. Mom, it's okay, just try to breathe. Here, let me help you sit up." Without thinking, Richard knocked on the door, surprising himself as much as the room's occupants. There was a moment of silence before Jamie's cautious voice called out, "Who's there?" Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. It's the man from the restaurant. I wanted to see if you needed any more help." The door opened a crack, and Jamie's suspicious face appeared. When he recognized Richard, his eyes widened with a mixture of confusion and hope. "Sir, you followed me home." Richard struggled to explain his presence, finally settling on "I was concerned. Is your mother all right?" Jamie hesitated before opening the door wider, revealing a single room that served as their entire home. The space was impeccably clean despite the crumbling walls and water stains on the ceiling. In the corner, a thin woman lay on a mattress on the floor, propped up by several worn pillows. Her resemblance to Jamie was striking, the same expressive eyes, now sunken into a face pale with illness. An oxygen tank stood beside her, connected to a mask she held weakly to her face. "Mom, this is the man who helped me last night," Jamie explained as he hurried back to her side. The woman tried to smile and removed her mask momentarily. "Thank you for your kindness to my son," she managed before another coughing spell overtook her. Richard stood awkwardly in the doorway, overwhelmed by what he was seeing. A small table held medicine bottles, carefully arranged beside a stack of past-due medical bills. Nearby, a wheelchair sat folded against the wall, explaining the need for the ramp outside. This wasn't the home of people who weren't trying. This was the home of people fighting an impossible battle with dignity and love. As Richard tentatively stepped into the room, his eyes fell on a small desk in the corner where school books were neatly stacked. Despite their dire circumstances, Jamie's education clearly remained a priority. Beside the books lay several newspaper clippings advertising part-time jobs that required applicants to be at least 16 years old. With a jolt, Richard realized Jamie couldn't be more than 12. The boy was trying to find work, just as Richard had callously suggested, but was consistently being turned away due to his age. Next to the job listings was a half-finished drawing of remarkable quality, a portrait of his mother, but healthier, standing in a garden with sunlight on her face. The talent was undeniable. While Richard absorbed these details, Jamie was gently helping his mother take her medication, supporting her head with a tenderness that seemed beyond his years. "The doctor says this new prescription should help with the inflammation in your lungs, Mom," he explained with the confidence of someone who had become fluent in medical terminology out of necessity. "Jamie, how old are you?" Richard asked quietly, unable to hide his growing distress at the situation. The boy glanced up, still focused primarily on his mother. "I turned 12 last month, sir," he replied. The woman, Sarah, as Richard would soon learn, reached for her son's hand. "Jamie has been taking care of me since my accident 2 years ago," she explained between labored breaths. "I was a nurse before," She gestured vaguely at the wheelchair. Richard listened as their story unfolded. A drunk driver, a spinal injury compounded by a weakened immune system, medical bills that had devoured their savings and cost them their home, and insurance that had run out long ago. Throughout it all, Jamie had become his mother's caretaker, nurse, and provider, sacrificing his childhood for her survival. He should be playing with friends, not worrying about adult problems, Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. But I haven't been able to find work I can do from home, and the disability payments barely cover rent. The following day, Richard returned to Jamie and Sarah's basement apartment, this time with bags of groceries and a specialist business card. He's the best pulmonologist in the state, Richard explained as he unpacked fresh fruits and vegetables onto their small table. I've arranged for him to see you tomorrow morning. Sarah began to protest, but Richard held up his hand. Please, let me do this. I need to. He couldn't fully articulate the transformation happening within him, how the encounter with Jamie had shaken him to his core, and forced him to re-examine every assumption he'd made about poverty and success. As Jamie eagerly investigated the grocery bags, discovering foods he hadn't seen in months, Richard and Sarah spoke quietly. He's an extraordinary boy, Richard said, watching Jamie reverently handle a carton of eggs as if it were made of gold. The way he takes care of you, his determination, I've never seen anything like it. Sarah's eyes filled with pride and sorrow. He's had to grow up too fast, she said. Sometimes I find him awake at night, worrying about bills I try to hide from him. Richard's visits became regular over the following weeks. What had begun as simple charity evolved into genuine connection, as he found himself increasingly drawn to this small family's resilience. He brought not just necessities but also art supplies for Jamie, having recognized the boy's talent, and books for Sarah, who had been an avid reader before illness consumed her energy. With proper medical care, Sarah's condition began to stabilize, though the years of inadequate treatment had taken their toll. Meanwhile, Richard found himself sharing meals at their small table, listening to Jamie's dreams of becoming an artist, and sharing stories from his own childhood, stories he had never told anyone about his own struggles growing up with little support. Something was shifting in Richard's worldview, a fundamental change that made his luxurious penthouse feel strangely empty when he returned each night. The deals he closed at work no longer brought the same satisfaction. Instead, he found himself wondering how he could use his resources and connections to make a more meaningful difference. One evening, as Jamie showed Richard his latest drawing, a surprisingly accurate portrait of Richard himself, the boy asked a question that struck at the heart of Richard's transformation. Why did you change your mind about me? That night at the restaurant, you told me to get a job. You seemed so angry. Richard set the drawing down carefully, giving the question the consideration it deserved. I was wrong, Jamie, he admitted, the words feeling foreign yet necessary. I thought I knew what made people successful or unsuccessful. I believed it was all about hard work and determination. He glanced at Sarah, who was listening quietly from her bed. But I didn't understand that sometimes, no matter how hard you work, or how determined you are, life can put obstacles in your path that are nearly impossible to overcome alone. Jamie nodded thoughtfully, his wisdom far beyond his years. Like Mom's accident, Richard smiled sadly. Exactly. You and your mother work harder than anyone I know, but you've been fighting a system that's stacked against you. 3 months after their first encounter, Richard arrived at the basement apartment with documents in hand and excitement he could barely contain. I've found you a new place to live, he announced as Jamie let him in. Sarah looked up from the computer Richard had brought her, a machine that had allowed her to start doing medical transcription work from home, utilizing her nursing knowledge. Richard, we've talked about this, she began, her voice stronger now but still firm. We appreciate everything you've done, but we can't accept such an expensive gift. Richard shook his head, pulling up a chair. It's not what you think. I've started a foundation to help families affected by medical crises and inadequate healthcare coverage. You'd be its first beneficiaries. Yes, but not the last. He spread the papers on the table, Plans for affordable housing units with medical facilities on site, designed specifically for patients with ongoing care needs. The foundation will subsidize your rent based on income, and as you continue to recover, Sarah, there will be opportunities for you to contribute your nursing expertise to help others. Jamie looked at the blueprints with wide eyes, his finger tracing over the spacious apartment that would be theirs, one with 2 bedrooms, an accessible bathroom, and even a small studio space where he could develop his artistic talents. "Is this real?" he whispered, afraid to hope too much. Richard placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture that had become natural over their months of friendship. "It's real, and it's just the beginning. Your mother's medical knowledge is valuable, Jamie, and as she gets stronger, she'll be able to advise the foundation on the needs of patients. And you," he squeezed the boy's shoulder gently, "I've arranged for you to meet with an art teacher who believes your talent deserves nurturing." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she reached for Richard's hand. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked softly. Richard's answer came without hesitation. "Because you and Jamie taught me what really matters. Success isn't about how much money you make. It's about the difference you make in people's lives." The day Jamie and Sarah moved into their new apartment marked 1 year since that fateful encounter outside the restaurant. The transformation in their lives was remarkable. Sarah's health had improved significantly with proper care, and she had begun working part-time as a patient advocate for the foundation. Jamie, now 13, was flourishing in school, and his art was gaining attention, with 3 of his pieces being displayed in a local gallery. But the most profound transformation had been in Richard himself. The man who once coldly told a desperate child to get a job had redirected half his fortune toward addressing the systemic issues that trapped families in cycles of poverty and illness. His business acumen, once focused solely on accumulating wealth, now tackled inefficiencies in healthcare delivery and affordable housing, with innovative solutions that were beginning to gain national attention. As he watched Jamie excitedly explore his new art studio, Richard reflected on how a moment of reluctant compassion had evolved into the most meaningful chapter of his life. The foundation Richard established with Sarah's input grew rapidly, identifying and supporting families caught in similar circumstances across the city. What began as a personal mission became a movement as other wealthy business leaders, impressed by the tangible results, joined the cause with their own resources and expertise. Richard found himself frequently sharing the story of how a 12-year-old boy changed his perspective, though he was always careful to protect Jamie and Sarah's privacy. "I used to believe that success was a simple equation," he would explain at fundraising events. "Work hard, make smart decisions, and you'll succeed." But meeting Jamie showed me that the equation has invisible factors: access to healthcare, safe housing, quality education, and perhaps most importantly, someone who believes in you when circumstances seem hopeless. These speeches, delivered with a humility that surprised those who had known the former Richard, resonated deeply and opened wallets that might otherwise have remained closed. Sarah's recovery continued steadily, though some damage from years of inadequate treatment would never fully heal. Nevertheless, her knowledge and experience made her invaluable to the foundation, where she developed training programs for volunteers who supported families navigating complex medical systems. When Jamie and I were alone, the hardest part wasn't just the financial strain, she would explain to new volunteers. It was the isolation, the feeling that no one understood or cared about our struggle. This insight shaped the foundation's approach, ensuring that practical support was always accompanied by genuine connection. Meanwhile, Jamie thrived in his new environment, his artistic talents nurtured by mentors Richard had introduced him to. The boy who once begged outside restaurants was now creating commissioned artwork, with proceeds going to his college fund. Yet despite these positive changes, Jamie never forgot what it felt like to be invisible to those who passed by him on the street, and his art often captured the dignity and humanity of people society tended to overlook. As the 3 of them shared dinner on the anniversary of their first meeting, Richard raised his glass in a toast. "To second chances and unexpected teachers," he said, smiling at Jamie and Sarah. The apartment was filled with warmth, light, and the smell of a home-cooked meal, a stark contrast to the damp basement where he had found them. "You know," Sarah remarked, looking healthier than she had in years, "I used to pray for a miracle when things were at their worst. I never imagined it would come in the form of Jamie being told to get a job by a grumpy millionaire." They all laughed, the painful memory now transformed into a story of redemption. Later, as Richard prepared to leave, Jamie presented him with a new painting, a portrait of all three of them, rendered with remarkable skill and emotion. "Your family now," the boy said simply, hugging Richard with unrestrained affection. Driving home to his penthouse, which he had recently decided to sell in favor of a more modest home closer to Jamie and Sarah, Richard felt a contentment that all his wealth had never previously provided. The harsh businessman who once judged others based on their apparent productivity had discovered a deeper truth, that compassion, not competition, was the force that truly enriched human lives. The foundation's success eventually caught the attention of national media, and Richard found himself being interviewed about the dramatic shift in his business philosophy. "Many people are calling you a changed man," one reporter commented. "What exactly happened that caused such a transformation?" Richard considered the question carefully, aware that Jamie and Sarah were watching the live broadcast from their home. "I met someone who showed me that my measure of success was fundamentally flawed," he replied thoughtfully. "I had achieved everything I thought I wanted: wealth, status, influence, but I was missing the point entirely." The reporter leaned forward, intrigued by his candor. "And what was the point?" Richard smiled, thinking of Jamie's determined face as he had counted those few coins outside the restaurant. "That true wealth isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you give. That strength isn't about power over others, but about lifting others up when they can't stand alone. And most importantly, that no one, not even a self-made millionaire, succeeds entirely on their own. We all need help sometimes, and extending that help doesn't create dependency. It creates community." Back at home, Jamie and Sarah watched the interview with pride. "He didn't mention us directly," Jamie noted, grateful for the privacy Richard had always respected. Sarah nodded, squeezing her son's hand. "He doesn't need to. Our story is just one of many now." Indeed, the foundation had grown to support hundreds of families, creating a network of care that addressed not just immediate needs but long-term stability. For many of these families, Richard's compassion had created turning points similar to what Jamie and Sarah had experienced, moments when hopelessness gave way to possibility. After the interview, Richard received a text message from Jamie with a photo of his latest artwork, a painting of a city where people of all backgrounds were reaching out to help one another, creating a web of connection across artificial divides. The caption read simply, "This is what you started." Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion as he typed his response. "No, Jamie, this is what you started, when you showed me what courage really looks like." In the years that followed, Richard, Jamie and Sarah formed an unconventional but unbreakable family bond. Richard began to delegate more of his business responsibilities to focus on expanding the foundation's work, finding far more satisfaction in this mission than he had ever found in corporate acquisitions. Sarah's health continued to improve, and she eventually became the foundation's director of patient advocacy, using her first-hand experience to shape policies that recognize the dignity of every person seeking help. And Jamie, the boy whose quiet determination had sparked this remarkable journey, grew into a young man whose artistic voice grew increasingly powerful and sought after. His series of paintings depicting invisible struggles, inspired by his own experiences, traveled to galleries across the country, raising awareness and funds for the foundation's expanding mission. At each exhibition opening, he made a point of sharing how a moment of desperation outside a restaurant had somehow led to all of this, emphasizing that change could begin with the smallest acts of compassion. On Jamie's 18th birthday, Richard surprised him with news that he had established a scholarship fund in Jamie's name for young carers, children who, like Jamie had been, were responsible for looking after ill or disabled family members. "Your story will help others understand that these kids aren't just statistics," Richard explained as Jamie absorbed the enormity of the gift. They're heroes who deserve every opportunity to pursue their own dreams while knowing their loved ones are properly supported. The first recipients of the scholarship had already been selected. 5 teenagers who had been caring for parents or siblings while trying to maintain their education. You'll meet them next week, Richard continued, watching Jamie's expressive eyes fill with emotion. They remind me so much of you. Sarah, now using a cane rather than a wheelchair most days, joined them with the birthday cake she had baked herself. Remember when we could barely afford candles? She mused, her voice steady and strong. Jamie nodded, looking between the 2 people who had formed his unusual support system, the mother who had fought to survive for his sake, and the stranger who had become family after initially dismissing him. As Richard drove home that evening, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a harsh get a job and evolved into a mission that had given his life true purpose. The investment portfolio that had once been his primary focus now served mainly to fund the foundation's expanding programs, and he couldn't imagine wanting it any other way. His phone buzzed with a message from Jamie, a photo of the boy and his mother smiling beside the birthday cake, with a simple caption, "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible." Richard smiled, remembering how close he had come to missing this connection entirely. How easily he could have continued walking past Jamie that night, his heart closed to the possibility that lay in reaching out to another human being in need. The biggest revelation of all had been discovering that in helping Jamie and Sarah, he had actually saved himself from a life of hollow achievement and isolation. "No," he whispered to himself as he typed his reply. "Thank you for teaching me how to truly see."